we have a full and hopefully thought-provoking evening ahead of us. So let's get started. One of my mentors told me years ago that the mind can only absorb what the backside can endure. So we're going to make it that we move around a bit tonight, but I need your help to make that work. So when I say let's go, we go, okay? Speed is the essence tonight. So can I ask you now to finish up and head through into the auditorium so that we can start the conference, and dessert will be served out here later in the evening over a group activity. Okay, so please join us. Thank you. Thriving in a demanding workplace. How can we meet these challenges that we face with clarity, conviction, and courage? Well, tonight we are considering the subject of resilience, and our objectives for the conference are twofold. Firstly, to provide professional women with practical skills and tools to help us become more resilient in our professional and our personal lives. And secondly, to see something of the difference that the Christian faith position can make to resilience. Nelson Mandela once said, "The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." Striving for a glorious life seems a worthy endeavor. So is resilience simply about rising every time we fall? Well, that is one of the questions we'll answer tonight. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you two women who will help us explore this important topic. So please join me in welcoming Jenny Brown and Caroline Spencer. So let me introduce you. Jenny Brown is a clinical social worker, author, and director of the Family Systems Institute. So firstly, Jenny, welcome, and tell us, please, what is the Family Systems Institute?
Well, the Family Systems Institute grew out of a private clinical practice that I had for a number of years, and we are a small organisation of about 9 people. We train mental health professionals and anyone else who's working with people in their jobs in an approach that you'll hear a bit about tonight, a systems approach, and we also have a clinical practice.
Okay, a clinical practice meaning?
Counselling. It's very broad, but our specialty is relationship context. So if people are working through a difficult time with low mood or anxiety, we will tackle that, but always considering how that sits in people's significant relationships, how to use relationships as a resource as well.
Okay, thank you. Tell us about your own family.
I am married to David for coming up 34 years. It's a bit of a shock. I have 2 lovely daughters who have grown up way too quickly, 29 and 27. I have a lovely son-in-law. I have to mention him before I mention the next special person, which is a 2-year-old grandson.
Oh.
Very special. Can't believe I'm a grandma.
Okay. Thank you. Caroline Spencer, Caro's the Women's Program Manager and trainer at City Bible Forum, and I have to tell you, an awesome chef. Every time though I ring Caro, she always seems to be, when I ring her in the early evening, she always seems to be at the gym. So I reckon that's the price you pay for being an awesome chef. She's just too good at baking cakes. Caro, tell us about City Bible Forum.
Sure. Before I do though, can I just say, isn't it lovely when someone calls you once and you happen to be at the gym and then they just think that you're there all the time? It's brilliant. It's all about being caught in the moment. City Bible Forum, we're an independent organisation and we like to ask the bigger questions of life, and we're interested in exploring, especially what the Bible has to say about those issues. And we like to do it in the least weird way possible. And part of doing it the least weird way possible is to show that the Bible actually has relevance for life today.
tell us about your role.
Yep, I'm the Women's Program Manager and Trainer. A large part of what I do is, I guess you'd classify as mentoring. If you're someone who's considering a career change, like you're an accountant and you want to become a lawyer, that's not really my area of specialty, but if you are actually interested in exploring the bigger questions of life and are curious about what the Bible has to say, then I'd love to have a coffee.
Right. Now, you're the mastermind behind this conference, so why did you choose the topic of resilience?
Yeah, well, resilience is a buzzword in the corporate sector. And when I was doing some online research and I looked at Harvard Business Review and places like that, a lot of the resilience chatter was more in the context of big economic events, the aftermath of those. So the GFC, for example, there was a flurry of activity after that. But when I was talking to people, I realised that what they find most challenging in terms of their well-being and performance in the workplace was more to do about relationships. So I actually did a poll, and 80% of the people that got back to me said that it was actually relationships that is most challenging to their resilience. So in us three talking, it was a case of, well, let's talk about the issue of resilience, but let's especially think about it in terms of relationships.
Okay. So Jenny, in your experience, is this typical, for relationships to be the derailers of resilience?
I do think so. Obviously not always. There are some other stressors that are external, environmental ones, and yet I still think, even with, for example, the loss of a job, cutbacks, an economic downturn, the way in which that's communicated to a person is so relational, so you can't escape it. And in relationships, we've got such core sensitivities that go right back to childhood and they go to work with us. So I think where we're at our most vulnerable, whether we're at work or with friends or at home, relationships is a place of great strength. It's where some of the best things happen to us, and it's the place of greatest vulnerability as well. Hence, resilience in relationships, I think that the two deserve to fit together.
So if you were to put those into a definition in your experience as a counsellor, how would you define resilience? I think we've got it something on the slide.
Well, I like Nelson Mandela's reflection on the capacity to keep going after a fall. And I do think that a good definition, as you can see up there, is this capacity to stay on track in the face of workplace relationship challenges or any challenge. The capacity to be able to continue to be goal-directed, be responsible with tasks, to keep functioning even when there are setbacks around a person. I think that's a key way of thinking about resilience. And I'm guessing, at least, that I'll be talking about examples later, but in helping organisations with their own training and culture, as you do with directors of change, I imagine you've got a few observations of whether relationships are part of resilience or not.
Hang on, I'm the MC, I'm the one asking the questions. Yes. If I think, there's bad stories and there are good stories. I recently reconnected with an executive team that I started work with 13 months ago. And when I started work with them, I remember being in a workshop where it was a highly emotionally charged workshop and quite combative. And I remember asking one of the executives, tell me when you are most alive at work. When are you absolutely at your best? When do you thrive? And he said, I love putting together highly complex deals, structuring deals and doing deals. And another executive then asked him very sensitively, but I'd say very courageously, how do you feel having lost a big part of that in the recent restructure? And there was this kind of hushed silence, and he said, it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult. And the whole mood in the room changed, and that level of honesty and self-awareness changed the way that this team started to relate to each other. And I think, it's a wonderful thing when that happens. It doesn't always happen, but it really helped this team to start the journey of functioning better together. And when I'm doing this kind of work with executive teams, helping them clarify their purpose and their goals and their principles, a big part of it is to help them appreciate each other's strengths and recognize their own foibles, their own issues, just that they're human and they do stuff that doesn't always help. And this team, I reconnected with them 3 weeks ago, and the change in them was astounding, absolutely astounding. And I think now I see a team that they value each other's different skill sets. They laugh at each other's foibles, they tease each other, they challenge each other quite directly, but they don't take it personally. They're able to be respectful in the way that they relate. And I think, that level of emotional maturity is quite unusual in an executive team. And I admire them hugely for what they've achieved. A lot has to do with their very facilitative leader, but also the fact that they made this behavioural contract and they've delivered and they're delivering results to the market, which is, the best judge of their performance. Yeah.
You've reminded me of something I've left out of my talk list. That not only can an individual work on resilience, an individual can contribute to a more resilient culture.
Yes.
And cultures and groups can indeed be resilient.
Yeah. And especially when you have an executive team, because they're behaving like that, because that drives the culture right through the organisation. So, yeah, it was I would say, a high point of my career to date, but it's not typical. Usually it's a lot harder than that. And I think all of us in some way or another face relationship issues at work. A lot of my job is helping people manage, as yours is, through those. Helping one ego cope with another ego. Yeah, I think we all face it. So I think we thought what we would start with is a group activity tonight where we look at what are some of the typical issues, relationship issues we face at work. And then once we've done that, we'll hear from Jenny and from Caro, and then we'll come back to those issues later and see what, if anything, we can apply to them. So that's the approach we'll take. So this is where we start logistically. I'll try and sort of manage through this. If we have a look at the activity, so we're going to get into groups of. We're going to try for 8 people-ish. If it's 9 in one and 7 in another, that's okay. But groups of 8 people. And the way we'll do it is we'll try and get sort of 4. The idea was it's easy to write a slide and then you get the room set up differently. But that's okay, we can do this. So you basically want sort of 4 people to turn around to the 4 behind and work together, and then you do the same at the back, and then maybe the people on the back, you might even want to move and just get, so we're aiming for groups of 8. So just This was a tough ask to get you to just suddenly get into groups of people you don't know and come up with your relationship challenges at work. So I salute you for what you've done. Okay, are you ready? Stepping into a senior position when having to manage people with longer tenure. Yeah, tough. Resistance to change, process improvement, dealing with different personalities. Managing expectations as a contractor, office politics, work politics, a team leader not able to lead the team, so people's capacity to do their job. Miscommunication, different mix of performance. When people don't understand, communication has to be two-way. Employers and employees at different life stages with different expectations of time. Bullying, lack of respect, different attitudes and outlook and personalities. Different values and competing interests. Negative attitudes. Communication, lack of trust. Mothering managers, emotionally draining impact. Cross-cultural workplaces. Harshness, unapproachability, anxiety, fear at work, unclear expectations again, lack of feedback, being wrongfully accused of something, bullying again, difficult emotional clients, unrealistic demands, negative co-workers, not handling stress well, unrealistic expectations, communication, again, cultural differences again, perceived or actual underperformance, gossiping, malingering, maligning. Change, be it structural or organizational, ownership, roles, responsibilities, people taking accountability, managing conflict, different goals, difficult boss, oh yes. Communication issues, conflicts arising from different managers, different instructions from one place to another. So one person telling you one thing, one another, especially with the way organizations are set up now, where you have these you have this, and especially so much is done by project teams now, isn't it? And you have to go across different areas. Oh yeah, it's a nightmare. Dodging responsibility to protect themselves, uncooperative colleagues, abuse of power, when you can't trust your manager, personality clashes, I'll try not to repeat ones we've had already, lack of support from your boss, blaming, yeah. So, Jenny, how do we face these challenges with clarity, conviction, and courage? Over to you.
What a daunting task. It's kind of a depressing list, isn't it? It's a challenging topic. So what I'm going to do is take you through some practical ways of building resilience in the face of those myriad of challenges. And I want to start by telling you a story of two women in the same workplace. I'll change their names. I'm going to call one Ali and one Cindy. This is a real workplace, a real situation. Ali is a team leader, and she is so focused at the moment on her team not coping. She's feeling extremely responsible for the stress they're in. There have been huge cutbacks, job freezes, people leaving, they're not being replaced. And Ali is finding she's getting close to burnout, but she's putting so much focus onto helping her team cope. Interestingly, as I talk to her team, the more she's trying to help them out and support them, the more many of them are struggling and collapsing and needing stress leave and taking more time out. So that's Ali. Second one is Cindy. And same workplace. Admittedly, she doesn't have the leadership responsibilities on the team, but she has managed, in the face of quite stressful cutbacks and changes to the work culture, she's managed to stay on task. She's not getting caught in lots of meetings, informal and otherwise, to try and talk about how do we manage all the stress and what the bureaucracy is doing to our organisation. She is able to take a project, focus on it and deliver good work. So what's the difference? You can tell which is the most resilient at the moment, Ali or Cindy. And as I think about the topic and what the definition of resilience is, this capacity to be able to stay on task
even when things around you, many of them are things that are outside of one's control, when they're falling apart, is it possible to hold self together enough to keep doing a good enough job? Sometimes that's the best that anyone's going to be able to manage. And I'm going to talk about two elements of resilience building in relationship context. The first is inside of us, and the second is outside of us, our interactional. So first of all, you've got the intra-psychic management of stress at work. And secondly, you've got the interpersonal management. And I'll divide my talk tonight into some tips for both of these areas. So the first area is the intra-psychic, and thinking about our relationships, having an awareness of relationships. Let's see where I am. Yeah, the self-regulation is so key to resilience and good emotional health in any environment. So when I think about self-regulation, I can't emphasize enough, it's the 101 of managing any difficult environment is the capacity to calm oneself. And you can see on the slide I've got up there that we've got these brilliant physiological, biological resources to manage stress, and there's no point having a relationship strategy if you're not calm enough to be thoughtful and to think. So a few key tips on self-regulation. I'm sure all of you could share some good ones with each other on what you do to calm your physiology down when tension mounts. And I've been working on them tonight before getting up to do the talk. A really lovely one that I have learned is to warm fingertips, to warm hands. It's a beautiful way of signaling to the brain to not be on high threat alert. So here's a little exercise you can do with me. Just put your fingertips onto your cheeks and notice if your fingertips are the same temperature as your cheeks. Anyone pretty much equivalent? A few are nodding their head. How many have colder fingertips to their cheeks? The majority. I'd put my hand up and say that's the case. Some people will have warmer fingertips, a smaller number to their cheeks. Now the ideal, if you are in a really calm, ideal resting position, your fingertips and your cheeks will be the same. And the reason for that is because when we are stressed and our adrenal system gets going, the blood rushes to our vital organs, it's not in our extremities, and so our fingertips are colder. So if you notice, if you do that little test in a stressful environment at work of your fingertips on your cheeks, and then think, I could calm myself down by sitting on my hands and warming up my fingers. There's a good little tip for self-regulation. Very useful. The best trick to calming ourselves down that is, we don't need to go off and do a special course to do, it's just built into us, a God-given capacity, and that's the capacity to breathe well. Just to slow our breathing down. Do you know that the ideal resting rate of breathing is 12 seconds of inhale and exhale? If we had more time, I'd get you to time your breathing and see if you can actually do a 6-second inhale and a 6-second exhale. That's a resting rate. If you're having to get up in front of an audience at work or perform a difficult work task, it won't be so slow. But if you can slow your breathing down just to get your thinking back at work, it's a really valuable step towards building resilience. So we'll move to thinking about interpersonal resilience. Elise talked earlier about, and Caro also, about how many stressful experiences at work are linked to relationship difficulties. The research, there's not a lot of research that looks at relationship stress. I'm not sure why that is. I suspect there are too many variables and it isn't easy to research the different dynamics of relationships. But there's one bit of research that has nothing to do with the workplace but everything to do with resilience. And it's by Professor Mark Flynn. And his research is longitudinal over 25 years on one Caribbean island, and he's researching the stress levels of children growing up on that island using cortisol samples from their saliva and other stress measures. In brief, here's a summary of his research, that these children's stress levels can come back to normal quickly after external traumas, even like a hurricane on the island, or an environmental upset like a political coup. But their stress levels struggle to return to normal when relationships are disrupted, particularly in their families. So I think that just sets the tone as to why is it that relationships can derail our resilience more than external factors. And the other piece of research alluded to on that slide comes from some research studies in the UK, I suspect very similar to our conditions of work and what people find stressful at work here in Australia. But in the two studies that I looked at, you'll notice that there are a range of things that are in the kind of top 5 of stressors: long hours, job security. Work relationships comes in at number 3, resources and communications. But when I drilled back these categories and looked at what's involved, even things like too much workload and long hours is related to a demanding boss. And then you take job security, it's related to a sense of competition for work, or people not giving credit or taking the credit for work you've done. So relationships seem to be attached to every single one of these factors, which I think is very interesting. So moving along and thinking about how to deal with resilience, I've set out the thought that every stress at work has some kind of a relational connection. And I think it's useful to consider the key sensitivities that we all have from our relationships growing up that we take to work with us. And here are 4 that I wonder if you might be able to recognize them. You've got the sensitivity to approval, the sensitivity to how much attention am I getting, the sensitivity to expectations, meeting people's expectations, or are they meeting my expectations, and the sensitivity to distress in others. Just stop for a moment and think which of these is your vulnerable point in terms of potential derailment of your sense of steadiness at work. Have a think about the 2 case examples I gave you earlier, and think about Ali and how much of her emotional energy is invested in looking after her team, and it's moving her to burnout. Which of those do you think would be her key sensitivity? I would say distress. The distress in others is a key sensitivity. For myself, I'll share with you the one that I've had to work most on, and it's attention. And when I think back to why it is that if I'm sensing that I'm excluded and I'm on the outside, I find it harder to stay on task and function at my best. And if I look back to my experience in my own family growing up, I was my mother's confidant in my teenage years. I knew I was very special to her. She would confide in me about things that she was worried about with my brothers and sisters, and I felt that her attention gave me a place of importance in the family. I wasn't aware of that growing up. I've had to become aware of it as an adult. But can you appreciate how when I got steady through her attention on me, positive attention, that you put me in a work context where I'm isolated and not getting that sense of approving attention, not having people need my advice. You wonder how I got into the field I'm in. that can be a derailer. So for my resilience building work over the years that I've been aware of these sensitivities, I practice not being important. I practice deliberately staying in the background and focusing on tasks, because that's where I can grow resilience. I won't grow my resilience by always seeking attention and approval. That just keeps me immature and more vulnerable to being derailed at work. So I wonder if I've got you thinking about your own sensitivities and what you might be able to work on to build your resilience at work. Here are a few other tips that I think are key to relational resilience at work. Staying connected. When you're experiencing a challenge at work, such as that extraordinary list that Elise read out earlier, when somebody is pushing your sensitivity buttons, the most natural thing to want to do is avoid them, right? Distance is very attractive when a relationship is difficult. And the most useful thing that can be done in the face of relationship challenge is to make that effort to stay connected with the people that you find most difficult. It's hard to do, but it really can help in building resilience. The next one is the challenge of what's called relationship triangles in systems theory. When we're stressed at work or in any other relationship, it is so natural to want to vent to a third party, just to say to the next person we run into after a difficult encounter with a boss or a colleague, you won't believe what just happened to me and what that person did to me and the way they spoke to me and how they're undermining me. And you've chosen a person who you expect will side with you. We all do this. It's the easiest way to calm ourselves down when we're stirred up through relationship distress at work or at home or in a friendship group. But the problem with venting to a third party and inviting them to take our sides is that we're less likely to work on sorting it out and defining ourselves back to the person who's upset us. And the more that we avoid doing that, the less we build clarity and strength and courage in our relationship settings. So I'd like to suggest that venting to third parties will happen, and it's not always a bad thing, but just to stop and think, is my detouring to this person getting in the way of me practicing dealing with it in the relationship it belongs in? And if I think back to the example of Ali in her workplace and her team leadership position, she found that in her effort to be nurturing and supporting her team members, all of them were coming to her and complaining about other groups in the organisation, and particularly complaining about the new boss who has triggered a lot of anxiety in the organisation, and she was becoming the receptacle for this third-party venting. It wasn't helping her team members work out their own way through it, and it certainly wasn't helping her. So just another little tip: watch for those third-party venting invitations, or when you do it yourself. The next one is to be responsible for expressing yourself directly at work rather than reacting to what's going on with others. When stress is high in relationship, the easiest thing to do is to go into blaming others, wanting to change others, wanting to talk about others. We get this other focus. And the most useful thing we can do to flex our resilience muscles is to work on ourself and to think about, how can I speak for myself in this challenging relationship? I'll give you an idea of a way to speak for self in a relationship and a tip for how to construct it. So avoid the word you. You are treating me poorly. See if you can take that word you out of it. You haven't acknowledged my work in this. And I could go on with lots of yous, which are quite accusatory and confronting, and that's only going to escalate relationship tension at work. So if you can practice using the word I experienced your taking that job, that task that we've been working on together, I experience you taking that on at the meeting and without an acknowledgement of our joint work on it. For me, that was really discouraging. I experienced it as kind of leaving me on the sidelines because I've really valued working with you on it, and I would much prefer if we could continue to convey that work as a joint exercise. So do you get the different tone of you shouldn't have done that to me to here's how I experienced it and this is what I would prefer. If you're wanting to define yourself to others in any relationship, it's very useful to be able to say, here's what I'm willing to go along with in this stressful situation, but here's what I'm not willing to go along with because I don't see that it fits under my job description or job responsibility. Just pause for a moment to think about helpful self-talk. Tomorrow when you're at work and facing some challenges with the people that push your sensitivity buttons to attention or approval or expectations, or you see them distressed and you're feeling like you're getting derailed from staying with task, what would be one of the most useful things you could remind yourself from what you've heard tonight? Just start to think about what would be good self-talk. And on the next slide are some of the things that I find useful to do and to say to myself when I'm feeling those sensitivity buttons being pushed. The first one is to slow it down. Step away, get perspective. When anxiety is high, our brains exaggerate the landscape, the negatives, and we do distort how we're interpreting things. So the very first step is that self-regulation, breathe, warm up the hands, calm down, get perspective. If you talk to a third party who can help you get perspective rather than just take your sides and say that's awful the way they treated you, a third party who can help you look at the facts, very useful. And then the self-talk that I'd be using is to remind myself that no matter what's going on for other people, and there'll always be anxiety at work, my job is to work on being responsible for me and bringing my best to this particular interaction, and to stay on task, just to coach myself in the midst of the stress, not to get too focused on the relationship dilemmas. I'm there to do a job. Stay in warm connection with others, but think about what's my job description, what tasks can I continue to prioritize to stay on track. That was what Cindy, in my example at the beginning, was doing so well in her workplace. She was able to choose some projects that were priorities in her job description and stay with them in spite of the challenges going on around her. If you can coach yourself, if I can continue to coach myself to stay with what's in my control, to be responsible for my own integrity, for conveying my values for the kind of employee or boss that I want to be at work, no matter how other people are responding around me, that will build resilience so much more than a focus on others, which gets into seeking validation from others, trying to please others, noticing what they think of us all the time, or as Ali was getting into in her workplace, feeling responsible for the happiness and well-being of others. It's overstepping boundaries to get caught in relationships that can be so draining. So to pull this together, workplace resilience, have you been able to follow that we've got two components to it? The first one is to think about the intra-psychic. You start with yourself and remember that when there are challenges that are pushing your buttons at work, your sensitivity buttons, you stop and use your good skills of breathing and reducing muscle tension and warming up your hands or going for a walk to calm self down. Part of the intra-psychic is also self-awareness, just thinking, what are the particular relationship dilemmas at work that always push my buttons? How does the way I related to my parents growing up give me a clue as to why that particular button of not feeling approved of has gotten pressed? So that's the intra-psychic part, and then the interpersonal piece, just as a bit of a recap. To stay responsible for self in connection with others. Keep contact with people, because if we distance from others, particularly when we're feeling anxious about the relationship with them, distance breeds negativity. Have you noticed that at work? When you avoid somebody, you naturally start to think the worst and interpret everything they do through a negative lens. If you can keep contact with the difficult people at work, the people that you find difficult, and calm contact, just to say, how was your weekend? Or what do you think of the new coffee shop around the corner? How would you rate the strength of their brew? Just small talk has its place to stay in connection with people when tension is high. And then the other interpersonal piece to remember is avoid the detouring and side-taking, and avoid the invitations from others to take their side, which will calm them down but possibly reduce their own resilience. So the quote that I have up here to wrap up this part of this evening's talk is from my book, which is called Growing Yourself Up. And in a sense, growing up and growing maturity is all about resilience. I do have a chapter on building resilience in the workplace, and I think it's important to just expect that workplaces, like any relationship setting, are going to regularly be tense, because you've got this cluster of diverse people who are having to bump up against each other regularly. And that's going to breed challenges. Everyone's sensitivities are at work. We don't know what our colleagues are bringing from their own family experiences and what's going on in their relationship world at home. And it's overwhelming if we move into trying to manage everyone else. But if we can manage bringing our best in terms of our calm, our principles, our goals, and staying on track, then we can grow our resilience and be a resource to others. Relationships are like the gym of interpersonal resilience building, of individual resilience building. You can't build resilience by retreating or going off to a health farm for a week. It might help with the calming down, but real resilience happens in the laboratory of predictably challenging relationships. And that's the last thought that I'd like to just put out there for you tonight, is just think about tomorrow, when we all go back to work, and think about some of the challenges that push your sensitivity buttons. I wonder if you'd be able to think tomorrow that here's a laboratory for resilience growing.
Jenny, thank you so much. Every time I hear you talk, I think of situations with clients where I could apply those things, but I also more scarily think of things that I am doing that I could do differently. So I'm sitting here personally feeling challenged right now. I'm keen to hear I'm keen to hear your take on what Jenny's just had to say.
Yes, one of the highlights for me in what Jenny is saying is that the 4 relational sensitivities that she talked about, so the approval, attention, expectations, distress in others, I've heard those before, and what I really love is it gives you some other options. Need for approval, yes, I'm onto that one. And it's actually helpful to go, there could be other things going on in my headspace. Yeah. And I remember I was at a work function and a little while ago and had a very negative interaction with someone. You know, where you think, oh yeah, things have happened in the past, we're fine. And then you see them and you realise it's not fine. I was actually able to go away from that and think, what were those 4 relational sensitivities again? Attention, approval, expectations. And so that was really helpful then to work out what to do next. Yeah.
Now, you're a follower of Jesus, and you're going to share a few thoughts about the difference that Jesus makes and faith in Jesus makes to being resilient. But after that excellent input from Jenny, couldn't we just all go home now?
Oh, yeah.
So,
why stay?
Yeah.
Why stay? Yes, you don't need to be a Christian to implement or grow the skills that Jenny's been talking about, but I do think faith can enhance our resilience, and so can enhance the skills that Jenny's been talking about.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I do want to apologise for my voice. When I get a cold or the flu, I really wish I had one of those sexy voices, but unfortunately I sound a bit like the nanny, if you remember that TV show. And I was talking with my boss today and he goes, you know, that's fairly appropriate. You're speaking at a conference on resilience and you're battling the flu. Anyway, speaking of my boss, what I didn't share earlier on is how much I enjoy working for my boss. He listens to my opinions and my ideas. He actually will explore the consequences with me. He's actually changed his mind on a couple of occasions, which has been really good. He doesn't micromanage me. He actually lets me work out for myself how to achieve my objectives, which is great. And I was talking to a friend the other day and she said, Caro, for people in your line of work, you really do have the ideal working environment. One day, actually it was about 6 years ago now, Peter, my boss, said to me, I just want to have a word with you. And I could feel my body stiffen and I could feel the defensiveness rise. And I blurted out, like a little kid, am I in trouble? And Peter goes, no, I just want to tell you you've been doing a really good job. where did all that defensiveness come from? And I thought, I know where that defensiveness comes from. I used to have a boss years ago that was a bit more like that. And what was his favourite phrase? I just want to have a word with you. So when Peter said it, it just triggered this defensiveness in me, which shows that I had a relational sensitivity. And it was really fortunate that Peter had something positive to say, but what if I'd been underperforming, and what if it was going to be more of a critical conversation? With all that defensiveness, I wouldn't have coped very well. The past can really sabotage the present, can't it? So how can we process what's happened in the past to actually help our resilience in the present? Because the more resilient we are in the present, then the less self-management we have to do. Well, here's a woman who has thought a lot about how to process the past. Her name's Hannah Arendt. She was a philosopher and she was writing in the 1950s. She's American, German and Jewish. And so she was writing with the backdrop of the Jewish Holocaust in World War II in mind. And in a book called The Human Condition, she wrote this: "The only remedy for the inevitability of history is forgiveness. In the natural course of things, we are stuck with our past and its effects on us. We may learn from our history, but we cannot escape it. We may forget our history, but we cannot undo it. We may be doomed to repeat our history, but we cannot change it. One thing only can release us from the grip of our history. That one thing is forgiveness." So forgiveness is the way that we stop the past from sabotaging the present. Well, if we don't forgive, what are the alternatives? Let's explore that for a minute. We could ignore what's happened, or we could seek revenge. If we ignore what's happened, which I guess is a way of denying what's happened in the past, doesn't actually stop the past from interfering with the present. I don't know about you, but I know of some examples where that just hasn't been true. The person hasn't been able to do that. So I have a good family friend who was abused in a relationship in the past, and she will quite honestly admit now that the relationship she's had since then haven't lasted that long, and that she actually finds it difficult to be vulnerable in relationships. So, you know, there's an example of it. Even though we're denying things, it doesn't mean the past actually stays in the past. And what about revenge? Can we escape the past that way? Well, the thing with revenge is all about the present being controlled by the past. So we can ignore what's happened, we can deny it, we could seek revenge, or we could forgive. And forgiveness is actually the way that we stop the past from sabotaging the present, from sabotaging our resilience in the present. Well, to forgive someone, that's actually a really hard thing. Here's a couple who had to think a lot recently about forgiveness. Their names are John and Anna Foley, and it was their son James who was the first American journalist to be executed in Syria by the ISIS militants. That was in the 19th of August of this year. And this is a quote that it was the headline in the UK Daily Mirror. And it says, "The family of executed US journalist James Foley said they were prepared to forgive the British terrorist who beheaded him. Showing astonishing courage, Dad John pledged that one day they would feel able to absolve the Islamic State fanatic known as Jihadi John. John Foley told millions on American TV, 'Not today, but as Christians we have to.'" Now that's a tough situation, isn't it? To think about forgiveness and to contemplate what that looks like. I was at a work function about a month ago, and I was talking with this woman that I'd only just met, and we were having a very interesting conversation, and I don't know how, but we got onto conflict in the workplace and how damaging some workplace relationships can be, and so you just can't sustain staying in that workplace. Anyway, who should walk up right at that moment? My old boss. I hadn't seen him for years. I don't know how he knew this woman. The woman didn't realise that we knew each other. So she introduces us, which is kind of her. But then, she began that nice conversational segue. Oh yeah, we're just having this really interesting conversation about conflict in the workplace and how some relationships are so damaging that you just can't sustain working there. And my old boss, hadn't seen him in years, went, right. He and I looked at each other, eyeballed each other. It was very awkward. But to be honest, I feel a bit embarrassed sharing that with you. I find it hard to forgive my boss, but that is nothing compared to what the Foleys have to go through. But the fact that I do find it hard to forgive my old boss, I think actually says something of the nature of forgiveness. That forgiveness is hard. Whatever it is, you've got to forgive. Why is forgiveness hard? Well, I've had an aha moment about forgiveness, and I want to share it with you. And it's actually got something to do with this. Now, that symbol is, I guess you'd say, the defining symbol of Christianity. And whether you're a Christian or not, I think there's something here that helps us understand why forgiveness is so hard. So what does that cross symbolise? Well, it symbolises death of Jesus. Why did he die? Well, forgiveness, to forgive our sins. So God sacrificed Jesus to forgive us. Forgiveness requires sacrifice. That is why forgiveness is hard, because forgiveness requires sacrifice. It's the nature of it. So, what do I need to sacrifice in order to forgive my old boss? I think the natural order of things is, if you hurt me, I hurt you back. Forgiveness is saying, I'm not going to hurt you back. Forgiveness is saying, this world of pain I'm in, it stops with me. So forgiveness, when you think about it, is actually an act of self-sacrifice. And that's why it's hard. That's why it's hard for me to forgive my old boss. But there is something that makes forgiving someone a little easier, and it also comes from the Christian faith. So I'll just show that to you briefly from some words of Jesus. So this is a prayer that Jesus teaches his followers to pray. And the line in pink there, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. So followers of Jesus, Christians, they enter this whole world of forgiveness where they ask God to forgive them and then they offer forgiveness to others. Now, what did John Foley say about forgiving the person who's executed his son? He said, we will forgive because as Christians we have to. So forgiveness is part of the DNA of Christians, but what makes it easier for a Christian to forgive is knowing that God's forgiven them, that God sacrificed his son for them. So what makes forgiving someone a little easier is if you've had an experience of forgiveness yourself. So whatever it is that you need to forgive, that really helps. Now this man, his name is Louis Zamperini, and he has a pretty amazing life, or has had, I should say. He died in July this year. His life was so interesting that Angelina Jolie is making a movie of it. Louis, can we go back there, Woody? Louis is American, and he had a troubled childhood, but he worked out quite quickly that he could run. And he ran so fast that in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Hitler asked to meet him. He then gets drafted into World War II as a fighter pilot. He gets shot down in the Pacific, and he spends 47 days in a life raft, which was a record. No one had ever done that before. He actually had to catch seagulls to eat and eat them raw just to survive, and he actually had to smack sharks on the snout, stop them jumping into the life raft to eat him. He does get rescued eventually, but he's rescued by the Japanese, which means he becomes a prisoner of war. And he spends time in prisoner of war camps in Japan, and there was one guard in particular that was sadistic and systematic in his torture of Louis, this former Olympian that he just wanted to humiliate. Louis is liberated at the end of the war. He goes back to America. And I should say that prison guard that was particularly horrible in his treatment of Louis, his nickname was the Bird. One day Louis opened a newspaper and saw a story that riveted his attention. A former Pacific POW had walked into a store and seen one of his wartime captors. The POW had called the police, who'd arrested the alleged war criminal. As Louis read the story, all of the fury within him converged. He saw himself finding the Bird, overpowering him, his fists bloodying the face, and then his hands locking about the Bird's neck. In his fantasy, he killed the Bird slowly, savouring the suffering he caused, making his tormentor feel all the pain and terror and helplessness that he'd felt. His veins beat with an electric urgency. Louis had no idea what had become of the Bird, but he felt sure that if he could get back to Japan, he could hunt him down. This would be his emphatic reply to the Bird's unremitting effort to extinguish his humanity. I am still a man. He could conceive of no other way to save himself. Louis had found a quest to replace his lost Olympics. He was going to kill the Bird. Louis goes to Japan, but he goes armed with a letter he wanted to give to the Bird. And here are some of the words that were in that letter. As a result of my prisoner of war experience, under your unwarranted and unreasonable punishment, my post-war life became a nightmare. The post-war nightmares caused my life to crumble, but thanks to a confrontation with God through the evangelist Billy Graham, I committed my life to Christ. Love has replaced the hate I had for you. Christ said, forgive your enemies and pray for them. So I forgave you. So what helped Louis to forgive the Bird was knowing that God had forgiven him. And when he was able to forgive the Bird, he was also able to stop the Bird and the past from sabotaging the present. Now, I'm not saying that only Christians forgive, because that's not true. But what I am saying is that Christians know that God has forgiven them, and that helps them to forgive others. And I should also say that the idea of it being a little easier to forgive others if you've experienced forgiveness yourself, that's not just for people who have amazing life stories that Angelina wants to make movies of. It's actually true in the ordinary cases as well. I know I've talked a lot about the situation with a former boss that I've had from years back, and as I've thought about my working life, that for me was a real challenge in terms of my resilience and also a real challenge in terms of my forgiveness. Shortly after things went pear-shaped between us, I thought, like John Foley, I have to forgive because as Christians we have to. But over time I realised knowing that God had forgiven me actually helped me to forgive him. And it was actually really good that I saw him at that work function about a month ago, because it made me confront where the relationship was and how I felt about him. And it was good in that interaction to see that the anger and the hurt and the bitterness that I'd had in the past just wasn't there anymore. That I actually have forgiven him, and that I can safely say the past is no longer sabotaging the present for me. Well, to conclude, what does faith add to resilience, or how does faith enhance resilience? Forgiveness is the way we stop the past from sabotaging our resilience in the present. Forgiveness is hard because forgiveness requires sacrifice. It's a little easier to forgive if you've been forgiven yourself. And both those things are at the heart of the Christian faith.
Thank you for those beautiful stories, inspiring stories of forgiveness. Jenny, let's ask the other way around now. How does faith impact what you talked about earlier?
Well, I loved hearing Caro then just make that distinction between strategies for the here and now and the present, and then something much bigger in dealing with past and uncertainties and what's it all about and what's work all about anyway. And I certainly know for myself, my own Christian faith, that's been a real precious gift to me since my teenage years. It has helped me in so many ways. It's hard to pick a couple, but two things come to mind. One is, as Caroline, you were saying, that when I am really struggling with how I feel at times taken advantage of as a boss at work on various things, there are two things that I remember. One is, I really do see from the servant-heartedness of Jesus that my job is to humble myself as well, to see that I've played a part in it, that there's some things I need to tackle in my own life. And just because of the example of Jesus, it really is easier for me to let go the angst and to maintain connection with people who've over the years moved on to other jobs, sometimes taken work and clients with them. That's what happens. But to be able to let that go, that my faith has really helped me with that. And I guess that's the forgiveness that you're talking about as well, Caroline.
So we've heard Jenny and Caro speak from two different perspectives. So what we would suggest you do now is just have a think for yourself individually. The slide's going to come up and say group work, but this isn't group work. This is just time for you to think about what you've taken away from these two talks and anything that you could apply. And we won't ask you to share it with anyone tonight. We're just going to give you a sheet in a moment that you can fill in and take away, or you can just write in your book, whatever's most helpful to you. The next part of the evening is food again, so dessert and group discussion at your tables over dessert, and then come back and we'll do a Q&A. So if I just explain the logistics and the activity, and then we can move outside. What we're asking you to do is to try and stay in your groups that you were in at the beginning, because you've got to know each other a little bit and you've discussed some work challenges. So together, go and find a table, and in your groups, whilst you enjoy dessert, we'd like you to identify your top 3 burning questions you would like to ask us. We will do our best to answer those questions after dessert. We'll come back in here. If you have somebody on your table, as you did before, who can just write them down, we've got a template on the table. So identify your top 3 questions and then number them 1, 2, 3, so that if we don't get through them all, we know which ones to go for. So we'll ask all the ones, and then we'll go down and ask all the twos and ask the threes. Okay, so, and then you should have somebody with a pink name badge should sit at your table and be able to take your sheet. So that's the plan, okay? First to say, these are incredibly thoughtful and challenging questions. And, sorry, Karen, we are delighted to start answering them, but in order to honour our commitment to finish at 9, we won't be able to answer them all. But we do commit between the three of us to get a document together answering some of these questions and email it out to you in the weeks ahead. Okay, so we won't be able to do it all tonight, but we will do our best to answer these questions electronically. Okay. So the way we'll do this, I'll go through and I'll pick out the number ones. We'll go through the number ones, and then we've got some final entries. Oh, they're too long. We'll do the first questions, and then we'll stop with about 3 minutes to 9, so that we can wrap up the conference. Okay. So I'll just read them out, and between us, we'll do our best. They won't be perfect, but we'll do our best. Q&A's are always scary. Right, from the two extremes you mentioned, actually this is really for you, Jenny, but from the two extremes you mentioned about Cindy and Ali, is the aim to strike a balance between Cindy and Ali, where we should stay on task like Cindy, but also help others like Ali?
Great question. I love Q&A because they kind of fill the gaps of my talks. It's like you can say, yeah, that needed to be drawn out a little. I would say the goal in terms of maturity is autonomy in connection. If you can put those two together, it's not more one than the other. So it's respectful, warm, generous connection, but autonomous responsibility for tasks. I do think in terms of those two examples that Ali was over majoring on the connection and not enough on her own, within her own boundaries and her job description. And that Cindy's focus on doing a good job, and I didn't make this clear, but if she can work on staying with tasks and still be friendly and respectful, I think that's a great balance. And it's not only a good balance for her, I think it will help lift the resilience of the whole culture when someone can do that.
It models a different way that other people can see and sometimes copy. Okay, another number one question. How do I work out what my key sensitivity is, and how do we deal with or approach this?
Be a good researcher. Take some time to think about 3 recent examples of feeling very vulnerable or derailed in a group setting, and take the 4 sensitivities. There are many versions of types of approval. All of them have different categories, but just stop and think which of these was my number 1 sensitivity in that example. Usually you'll have a combination, but there's kind of one that usually raises its head the most, such as with Ali, and her sensitivity to people being distressed would just derail her. She couldn't keep proportion with it, and clearly was a helper in her own family. That was what steadied her. So become a good researcher of the times when you felt derailed from resilience at work, and ask yourself, what were the patterns? What was I upset about? How did I react? What pushed my buttons? How did I try and recover? That's usually a good way to find it out. So for myself, if I try to recover by finding someone who gives me attention, so where we go to sort ourselves out gives you a good clue to those sensitivities.
So observe yourself.
Could I just ask a quick question? Do you have so you're saying there's a mix of sensitivities, but usually one. Do you have the same ones across different situations? Does that make
What
sense?
have
Or
you
do have a
found?
mix? Well, I think expectations might be mine, Jenny.
And does it go with you to most relationship settings where there's some anxiety? We don't see any of this if everything's calm.
Yeah, I'm doing research on it, but yeah, I just wondered whether that's a helpful, thing to know. Okay, if that's my sensitivity, then that's the first thing I can kind of think about in another situation, and could that be the same?
And then the question is, when you notice the sensitivity, is just say, how can I get proportion? Because sensitivities mean we exaggerate them.
Another question from the group: how to deal with managers who can't lead or lack knowledge? Okay, I'm going to have a go at that. I think the first thing is to, what have I learned over the years? To apply grace, but that comes from being a Christian. I think I can do that more easily now than before. So rather than getting angry that they're not who I think they should be, or they're not capable of doing what they should be able to, then I think, how can I enable them? How can I bring what I've got to offer to help them? So it's kind of a different way of thinking about it. I was working with a client some time ago, and she had exactly that issue, that it was a peer of hers who was not delivering, and she got so mad because this woman should be delivering, she should be doing this, I can't do my job if she doesn't do it. And she was wound up like a tea. And I said to her, let's look at some of the reasons why this could be. Maybe is she being protected in the organisation for some reason? There could be loads of reasons why this woman is able to not be competent and survive in the company. And I can either get wound up like a top, or I can just accept that stuff goes on in companies. It's not always logical, it's not always rational, it's not always reasonable, but I can do my best to do my part of the equation. And I think some of those principles apply with a boss as well. They're not always what they should be, and the best we can do is to do our best work and do our best to help them be as successful as they can. And that comes from, again, Jesus' servant leadership model of sitting at the feet and washing the feet of his disciples. So I don't know if anyone else has something to add. Okay, let's go. Now these aren't numbered, so I'm going to come back to those ones. Number 1, how to forgive yourself for the things you contributed in a relationship to build resilience and relational courage. How to forgive yourself for the things you contributed in a relationship to build resilience and relational courage.
I think it's a Caro question, but I'd just start with one thing that I'm convinced of in clinical practice over the years and watching my own part in relationships is that relationship problems are always co-created.
Yeah.
And we always are playing a part in our dissatisfactions. It might not be there are things that people do that are destructive, and they need to be accountable for those things. And there are things that are unintentional that still contribute to relationships not going well, such as avoidance. It's quite benign, but it doesn't help a relationship grow, and it can impair a relationship. Triangling, detouring to a friend and not dealing directly with the person. So I just throw that one in, that there is a co-creation. One of the verses in the Bible that fits so well with systems theory is Jesus' teaching on take the plank out of your own eye in the Gospel of Matthew before you take the speck of sawdust out of your brother's, your boss's, or your colleague's eye, making the point that you start with self. So if there are people here who are feeling burdened with that weight of how can I forgive myself, I think that's a broader issue that can be constructive on what can I learn, and I wasn't the only one who contributed to that difficult relationship.
Yeah, no, I think you expressed that well. I just think it's, that whole thing of realising, because it's often situations can be an either or, it's not them, it's me, I'm too sensitive, or the alternative is, actually, it's not me, it's you. And so that's actually helpful, the co-creation idea that we both sides contribute to difficulties in relationship, and there's a hurt there, and that hurt needs to be forgiven. And I just think that's helpful to keep in mind. It's not so much about who created the hurt, because it's both parties generally, but to be able to say the hurt is there and I need to forgive. Yeah.